I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1736 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, we're going to talk about what was it all about in Vietnam. If you ask most people, they'll say, we went to Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Many will argue that we failed there. The communists did take over all of Indochina, temporarily, but it's gone now. In the long run, we did win the war. Communism is withering away rapidly in Southeast Asia. Vietnam is becoming a big capitalist country. The Communist Party in Cambodia and Laos is literally withering on the vine like a dead tomato. It's not spreading anywhere. Thailand's not going to let it in. The Philippines aren't. Neither is Indochina, Australia, or those other countries in the neighborhood. Guess what? There is no more USSR. They're gone. China has become nothing more than a two-bit dictatorship intent upon kicking around their neighbors. They've also become the world's largest Walmart supplier. Things have turned out much differently from what the armchair historians predicted that it would. Due to research by a history professor up at the University of Connecticut, they're finding some very new and interesting things about the Vietnam situation back in those days. Apparently, it was a whole lot more than just trying to stop the spread of communism. There's a story about what this history professor is doing on the UConn Today website. Title of it is UConn Historian. South Vietnam Archives Provide New Insight into War. This professor is digging up things that would surprise you if you are not a student of Edward Lansdale, who created South Vietnam in the first place. This article tells about this professor and what she has discovered about the interesting new information about Vietnam during those days of the American-Vietnam War and why she found it. The story was submitted by Mr. Kenneth Best of UConn Communications. It's very enlightening. Let's take a look at it. Dateline, University of Connecticut. For most Americans who lived during the Vietnam War, their understanding of that conflict centered around the motivation of the United States to prevent the spread of communist rule in Southeast Asia. You see, it wasn't that we were trying to butt into other people's business, but we sort of don't like to watch hundreds of thousands of people being summarily murdered by their government. That's what communists historically have done. So you're going to have to cut us a break for trying to go over there and prevent that from happening. Continuing with the story. Despite what most people think, new research based on the examination of internal documents from the South Vietnamese government by Humanities Institute Fellow Nu-Ahn Tran, an associate professor of history in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences of UConn, tells a much different story. Most of the scholarship up until the opening of the Vietnamese archives argued, based on an American scholarship, that South Vietnamese President No Dien Diem took certain actions, often because the Americans told them to. Tran says, but when you find documents for the internal workings of government, what you realize is that No Dien Diem had a certain agenda. His advisors had certain agendas, and the policies they came up with often reflected that as much as any conversations they had with Americans. What she means is that President Diem had his own ideas. According to Ed Lansdale, President Diem did not listen to the Americans that much. He looked upon them as inconvenient outsiders he had to tolerate to get their assistance to fight the dirty commies. Tran, who has studied the history of the Republic of Vietnam as South Vietnam was officially known, hence the creation of the name ARVN, referring to the Army of South Vietnam. She is writing a book based on her research with the working title Disunion, Anticommunist Nationalism and the Making of the Republic of Vietnam, 1954-1963, which explores authoritarianism and democracy during the tenure of Nu-Ahn Tran. She says reviewing official documents housed at the National Archives Center, too, in Ho Chi Minh City, formerly known as Saigon, as well as in newspapers, periodicals, and other Vietnamese language publications, led her to identify what she calls the development of anti-communist nationalism. The dominant scholarship about Vietnam argues that the anti-colonial nationalist movement against French colonialism led to communism, which then became the North Vietnamese state and ultimately the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Tran says, referring to the official name of the post-war communist government, adding that she found an alternative story and sources produced by the Anti-Communist Republic of Vietnam. Memoirs by Vietnamese and from the RVN who are anti-communist offer a very different narrative, she says. What's interesting is to look at the narrative and how it reflects a particular historical experience and particular political trends. That's how I arrived at this idea of anti-communist nationalism, that this is how many of these political leaders and groups thought of themselves. Tran's interest in studying the nation of her heritage stems from growing up as a Vietnamese American and noticing that the way her parents discussed their native country varied from what she heard in schools and in the media. I was very interested in how to understand this from a Vietnamese perspective because of one of the defining differences is that, as you would expect Vietnamese people to think of themselves as the main characters in their story, just like everyone else in the world, she says. It's also informed by my own experience growing up with Vietnamese Americans who often seem to use the word democracy in different ways. I was interested in how these different political leaders and political factions in South Vietnam understood democracy, how they debated with each other about what democracy meant, and to understand how this was a word and a concept that has real meaning for them, that it wasn't something just imposed from the outside. Again, according to Ed Lansdale, the Vietnamese were very proud people and liked to stand on their own 2 feet. They weren't all that open to accepting outside ideas because they figured they had it all figured out. Back to the story. The conflict between Vietnamese communist and anti-communist was fought on the ground in the rice paddies and cities of Vietnam. A parallel conflict between American hawks and doves took place in the halls of the U.S. Congress, as well as protests on the streets of American cities and college campuses. American involvement in Vietnam divided the U.S. and saw 58,276 American soldiers killed and 303,600 wounded. Tran says her research demonstrates the complexity of Vietnamese politics and points to the similarity between Vietnamese debates and how to govern a nation and other debates about democracy and authoritarianism taking place across the decolonizing world. This particular book she is writing is about elite politics, not about politics of the grassroots level, she says. It's about elite politics and arguments between political leaders and political elites. That doesn't mean that some of them don't represent popular interest or try to. What you find when you look at these documents is that Vietnam had its own politics of the Vietnam War that doesn't necessarily line up with what was going on in the United States. It's just a very different political world with very different political camps. One of the lessons of doing research like mine is to realize that the countries have their own politics. One of the lessons of doing research like mine is to realize that those countries have their own politics, which is very complicated and makes sense in their own way, and they don't line up with our politics about those conflicts. Tran says Vietnam studies remains an undeveloped field of scholarship, with many areas not yet fully explored, in part owing to the fact that studies have long been American-dominated. No kidding, since we're paying for it. She adds this: my book establishes a narrative that explains how the Republic of Vietnam fits within the larger span of Vietnamese history, and it also establishes the Republic of Vietnam as a distinct entity with its own unique politics within the larger framework of the Vietnam War. I see the type of research I do as paving the way for more research of that type. I think she ought to go back to the Trung sisters in 44 A.D. That was an exciting story. This Vietnam veteran, for one, is very happy to see what Tran is doing up there at the University of Connecticut. Whenever so many Americans die in a war that we fought, like that one in Vietnam, we need to know as much as we can about it, so that hopefully we can prevent something like that from ever happening again. And thank goodness for people like Nu-Ahn Tran, the associate history professor up there in the University of Connecticut. She's doing a great job, and I'm looking forward to getting a copy of her book that she's in the process of writing, titled Disunion, Anticommunist Nationalism and the Making of the Republic of Vietnam, 1954 and 1963. Hopefully it will be out soon, and it will be added to the recommended reading list of the Vietnam Veteran News podcast. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1736 of the Vietnam Veteran News podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You are cordially invited to come again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?